And welcome to Days of Roar, a Detroit Tigers podcast brought to you by the Detroit Free Press. I'm your host, Tigers beat writer Evan Petzold. As always, I'm joined by Chris Brown from Tigers Minor League Report. We have a very full episode with a very special guest this week. So let's jump right into the week in review. Coming soon, we have Tarik Skubal versus the Detroit Tigers on Wednesday, February 4th, at a salary arbitration hearing that will determine $32 million or $19 million. The hearing is going to take place in Arizona. A panel of 3 arbitrators will determine whether Skubal makes $32 million, the amount that he filed for, or $19 million, the amount the Tigers filed for in the 2026 season, with no compromise in between. I am not expecting the two sides to come to an agreement before Wednesday's hearing. So barring this massive surprise, this is going to be settled on Wednesday in an arbitration hearing. And here's what's going to happen. The arbitrators are going to listen to the arguments and the rebuttals from each side in this case, and then determine whether Tarik Skubal is worth more or less than the $25.5 million midpoint. If he's worth more than that, even $1 more, they will select Skubal's $32 million proposal. If he's worth less, then they will select the Tigers' $19 million proposal. So there really isn't a whole lot more to it than that. But Chris, do you have any final thoughts before the Tarik Skubal versus Detroit Tigers showdown goes down? And do you want to predict a winner?
I mean, my main thought is let's just get this over with. You know, this has been a little bit of a saga here. I know it hasn't been too long, but you know, it's February now, and pitchers and catchers are about to report. And I would just like to think about baseball things that are actual baseball. I don't have a prediction who's going to win. I started off thinking that leaning the Tigers. I'm now leaning towards Skubal. It could be a landmark decision, but I don't think fans should really care about it that much. Right? They've already made their decision that the Tigers are cheaping out at Skubal, but I don't really think it's going to have long-term effects. It could be a landmark decision, but I don't think it's going to affect the Tigers anytime soon. Maybe with Riley Greene after 5 years in the minors, if this sets a new standard. But just happy to get it over with and get baseball started.
Pitchers and catchers report in 8 days. That happens February 11th in Lakeland, Florida. And the Tigers are still interested in mid-tier starting pitchers in free agency, as we've discussed numerous times on this show. But how do you think the Tarik Skubal arbitration hearing impacts those negotiations?
Yeah, I don't know if it impacts them that much. You know, we talked about this a little bit, and we think that because we've talked about, we think that they're going to target some other pitching. Maybe if Skubal wins, the pitcher that they target won't be as expensive. And maybe if he loses, they might go get Chris Bassett or somebody. But other than that, I can't really see it making a huge difference.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Like, we know the Tigers are shopping for these mid-tier starters in free agency. They want to bolster their rotation, and we've talked about the names that the Tigers have been targeting. Chris Bassett, Lucas Giolito, Nick Martinez, Jose Quintana. So I think no matter what happens in the Tarik Skubal arbitration hearing, the Tigers are going to sign another starting pitcher. Maybe it's Chris Bassett if they win, and it's Jose Quintana if they lose. But either way, I think the Tigers are going to sign another starter before opening day. Because right now, the Tigers starting rotation, it's Tarik Skubal, Jack Flaherty, Casey Mize, Reese Olson, and either Drew Anderson or Troy Melton. And I know the Tigers love Troy Melton, but if you read the tea leaves, I think the Tigers would be fine with adding another starter, pushing Drew Anderson to the bullpen, and letting Troy Melton develop a little bit more in AAA Toledo. Because when you look at Troy Melton, the stuff is there. He has a foundational fastball that is the centerpiece of his mix. But overall, he didn't miss many bats. He also allowed a ton of hard contact. So I don't think a stint in AAA is the worst thing for his long-term development. I think that's what the Tigers are considering. And then you look at the targets, Chris Bassett, Lucas Giolito, and Nick Martinez, Jose Quintana. You can make cases for all of them. Chris Bassett is the most durable with at least 30 starts and 170 innings in his last 4 seasons. Lucas Giolito, he has the highest upside as a former strikeout machine, but he also carries the highest risk because the track record is concerning, at least recently. And Nick Martinez, he's the most famous swingman in baseball. So Tigers could move him back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen, which could accommodate for the development of Troy Melton, the emergence of Ty Madden, or even the return of Jackson Jobe from injury later on in the second half of the season. And then you have Jose Quintana. He's a lefty. And aside from Tarik Skubal, the Tigers don't have another true lefty starter in their mix right now. So those are the 4 names to kind of keep an eye on. But I'm also not ruling out, and this is going to sound crazy, but level with me here. I'm not ruling out somebody like a Framber Valdez falling into the Tigers' lap. Like, this front office loves to be opportunistic. You'll hear that word a lot if you talk to President of Baseball Operations, Scott Harris, General Manager Jeff Greenberg. And this is definitely a situation where the Tigers could take advantage of a market that has completely collapsed. Like, I know Framber Valdez is 32. I know there's been a lot of buzz about Valdez to the Orioles. But if he's not getting what he's looking for in free agency, could the Tigers do a Jack Flaherty type deal where it's essentially a 1-year contract with a player option? And I'm not saying it's likely right now, and I'm not saying I'm expecting that right now, but if we do get on the other side of this Tarik Skubal arbitration hearing, and if the Tigers win the hearing to essentially save $13 million in payroll, and if Valdez still hasn't signed, then maybe the Tigers swoop in, just like they did with Jack Flaherty last February. And I know some people are worried about Valdez and the character. If you remember last year, there was the controversial cross-up with his catcher that appeared intentional. That happened last season. But if anybody knows about Framber Valdez and his character, it's guys like Orioles President of Baseball Operations, Mike Ilitch, and Tigers manager AJ Hinch. Both those guys were around Framber Valdez when he came up to the minor leagues and into the big leagues with the Houston Astros. So if AJ Hinch signs off on Valdez's character, then I'll trust that. We'll see if that happens. To be super clear, I'm not hearing any Framber Valdez to the Tigers buzz right now. As like we've mentioned, the Tigers have been shopping more in that mid-tier market. But never say never, like especially if this drags on. And most importantly, if the Tigers win their arbitration hearing against Tarik Skubal, do you think it's possible? And how would you feel about Framber Valdez joining this rotation?
I think you'd have to feel good about that. And I do think it's possible in the scenario that you laid out where it's getting real late early for Framber Valdez, right? Where it's February, he needs to sign somewhere. And the Tigers love to just, like you said, pounce and get a guy like this. So I could absolutely see him signing. I am almost wondering now, you mentioned Jackson Jobe. They're 9 days away from spring training officially starting, and then they could put Jackson Jobe on the 60-day IL and then go ahead and sign any pitcher they want. They've freed up a spot on the 40-man roster. So they may be waiting for that. Other teams may be doing that sort of thing too. So it may not be so much waiting for the Skubal news to come down as just waiting for that roster spot to open up. You could argue that they don't necessarily need to do that, but teams like to do that. And just the whole idea of it, we talked about this a bunch, but they love the word optionality. And, the worst case scenario is that Troy Melton, everybody stays healthy in spring training and Troy Melton's either in the bullpen or in Toledo. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is you have another good starter in case somebody does get hurt. And you could usually count on that happening. So I do think another pitcher is in the cards here. It's just a matter of, which one. Framber Valdez would be a nice one.
Last piece of news this week, we have new managers at 3 of the top 4 levels in the minor leagues, plus some other names to know. Andrew Graham, who spent the past 14 seasons as a manager in the Tigers farm system, including for AA Erie in 2025. He is no longer with the Tigers. His contract wasn't renewed. So with Andrew Graham's departure from the organization, here are the managerial changes in the minor leagues. Tony Capicelli advances from High A West Michigan to AA Erie. Rene Rivera, who I think is a rising star in the managerial world, he moves up from Low A Lakeland to High A West Michigan. And Salvador Paniagua makes the jump from the Florida Complex League to Low A Lakeland, with Brian Pena becoming the Florida Complex League manager after spending the past 2 seasons as the catching coordinator. And of course, Gabe Alvarez is returning as the AAA Toledo manager. So the 7 managers in the minor leagues for the 2026 season: Gabe Alvarez in AAA Toledo, Tony Capicelli in AA Erie, Rene Rivera in High A West Michigan, Salvador Paniagua in Low A Lakeland, Brian Pena in Florida Complex League, Marco Yepes in Dominican Summer League 1, and Sandy Acevedo in Dominican Summer League 2. Chris, you are the minor league expert. Do you have any thoughts on those names and their assignments?
I have a lot of thoughts. Now, you start with, first of all, the Tigers had the best minor league record in all of baseball last year. The organizational record was terrific. They won multiple titles. Part of that is because they often have the oldest teams in their respective leagues, but that's neither here nor there. Gabriel Alvarez I keep thinking he's going to join the Tigers staff at some point. He's been managing for 4 years. He went to the Eastern League Championship in AA. His first 3 years, won 2 titles. This last year started 5-17 with Toledo and ended up 84-66. So just an awesome job down there. And that's one of the toughest jobs in all of baseball, being a AAA manager, because your starter can get pulled up at any time and you've got to start a guy from A-ball or something like that. It's a really tough job. And so I think AJ Hinch and Chris Fetter have a lot of confidence in Gabe Alvarez.
And he's been in the mix too. I mean, you go back to when the Tigers hired Joey Cora, it was Joey Cora and Gabe Alvarez for that third base coach spot. And obviously it went to Joey Cora, but maybe Gabe Alvarez is just in waiting because Joey Cora, he's going to eventually retire at some point sooner rather than later. And that's a spot where you could totally see Gabe Alvarez taking over at a certain point in time. He's definitely on the radar of AJ Hinch and the Tigers.
Yeah, and then you've got these all well-deserved promotions. Tony Capicelli, all he did in West Michigan was have one of the best minor league seasons of all time. The Whitecaps went 92-39 last year with a run differential, a comical run differential of 294, and they won a ring. So it's well-deserved. And yeah, he's a very good detail-oriented manager. And then Rene Rivera, you talked about him being a rising star. I agree. He was the manager of the year in the Florida State League last year, also won a ring. And we used to have these arguments on the Tigers minor league report about who was the best manager in the minors last year. And you could argue any of these guys, but Rivera had to deal with losing a ton of his best players. He lost Bryce Rayner and Framber Valdez to injury, and then a ton of promotions. Woody Hedin, Jackson Strong, Lucas Ellisalt was one of his best pitchers. Josh Randall, RJ Sales were traded. Moises Rodriguez was his closer. He got called up. So to win that title was really impressive. And then Salvador Paniagua, he won a title with the FCL Tigers 2 years ago in 2024. And then last year they went 37-22. They had a great record. They made it to the playoffs. They were staging this massive comeback in the ninth inning of their playoff game, only to have a guy line into a double play to end it. So they were really close to getting to the finals again. So yeah, all these guys have done a great job. They've had winning teams, and I think it's a really strong managerial staff up and down the system.
Aside from the managers, the coolest note from the rest of the staff in the minor leagues is one of the new assistants is Cole Roberts, the 25-year-old son of Los Angeles Dodgers manager Dave Roberts. He will be the bench coach under Rene Rivera at High A West Michigan. Cole Roberts, he spent the past 3 seasons as a utility player in the minor leagues, reaching the AA level for 6 games in 2025. And now he's entering the coaching world with the Tigers. All right, we are going to skip the big 2 this week and get right to our guest, former Tigers general manager Al Avila. We spoke to him for more than an hour about everything you could imagine, including his hiring and firing, the entire rebuild, the Justin Verlander and JD Martinez trades, decisions like Jackson Jobe over Marcelo Mayer and Jace Jung over Zach Neto, the offseason of Carlos Correa and Javier Báez, Mike Ilitch versus Chris Ilitch, the evolution of Tarik Skubal, and so much more. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're joined by Al Avila. Everyone, I'd like to welcome former Detroit Tigers general manager Al Avila to the Days of Roar podcast for the first time. It has been exactly 3 years, 5 months, and 23 days since he was fired by owner Christopher Ilitch following more than 20 years with the Tigers, including the final 7 years in charge of baseball operations as the general manager. But here's a fun fact. If you look at the Tigers' current 40-man roster going into the 2026 season, Al Avila is responsible for 25 of the 40 players, including almost all the best players. So Al, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate it. I'm sure we'll have fun on this.
We have a lot to discuss, but it has been about 3.5 years since we've heard from you. What have you been up to, and what does retired life look like for Al Avila?
Quite honestly, at the very beginning, it was very hard for me. The first year and a half, you go from working basically 24/7, full bore, very little time off, if any, to where you do nothing. It's a very hard transition, and I did not accept that well. But luckily, I have a good wife that made some plans despite my objections. And I just kind of followed along, and I just fell into a good pattern of joy and happiness of traveling to different parts of the country, sometimes overseas. And then I have a daily routine where I go to church on a daily basis. I'm a lector. Sometimes I'm a Eucharistic minister. I do my little workouts. I check on family, and watch baseball during the baseball season and football during football season.
Well, baseball is right around the corner, and let's start with the current version of the Tigers, the 2026 Tigers. Just to kind of put this in perspective for people, Tarik Skubal, Casey Mize, Reese Olson, Cater Montero, Troy Melton, Will Vest, Dylan Dingler, Jake Rogers, Colt Keith, Spencer Torkelson, Javier Báez, Kerry Carpenter, Riley Greene, Parker Meadows, Wenzel Perez. Those aren't all the names, but those are some of the key players that you are responsible for bringing into the Tigers organization. And that's not even mentioning Jackson Jobe, Ty Madden. How much do you still watch the Tigers? And does it mean anything to you that 25 players on the current 40-man roster were acquired during the Al Avila era? Because it's not like you just left last season. I mean, it's going to be 4 years in August, and these guys are still here.
Yeah, well, they were very young, obviously. Most of them were drafted and a couple of them were acquired via trade, but we had a very good nucleus of players. I always felt that we were very close to the playoff contending team. And they're still there because they were young players. All those players were acquired over those 7 years. And as you know better than anybody, it takes some time to develop. And even when they get to the big leagues, there's still some development time there. So that's the fruit of the labor right there, which obviously, I'm very proud of that work and very proud of the guys that worked for me at the time that really put it all together.
What did you think about the Tigers' journey to the playoffs, both in 2024 and 2025, which were both historic? They got there in different ways. You had the historic run in 2024, and then you had the historic collapse in 2025, but both seasons ended in the ALDS in the postseason. What did you think about that? And then do you think the Tigers are built in 2026 to get past the ALDS, or do you think they might take a step back?
No, I think they're prepared to win for sure. I don't see Minnesota, right? I mean, I don't watch a lot of baseball, but I do watch enough to have a good feel. I really don't think Minnesota or the White Sox are ready to contend. I think Kansas City obviously is probably the best team there that they're going to give them some problems. But I think the Tigers right now are in a good position to win the American League Central, or at the very least be a wild card. So the nucleus is there. The young players are there. They've developed very well. A lot of them are not young guys anymore. They're actually, at the ripe age to really make a move forward. So I do expect them to win this year and hopefully get further because, as you know, once you get into the playoffs, things are different. And you got to really prepare for the playoffs in order to be successful there.
All right, so let's get into your tenure with the Tigers, and we're going to go way back into the time machine. April 2002. What do you remember about being hired as the assistant general manager under Dave Dombrowski? And then during your time as the assistant GM, what did you specialize in?
The move was very difficult for me because obviously my kids were young at that time. Alex, who we ended up drafting in the 5th round, I think it was 2009, he was in high school. I think he wasn't a freshman. He was probably a sophomore in high school. And then my daughter was in elementary school as was my son, Alan. So that was a very difficult transition. And, we were so successful in Miami with the Marlins, winning the World Series. We went through a sell-off. The team we left behind that won the second World Series was a lot of the players that we left behind. I mean, I drafted Josh Beckett in the 1st round. We had Edgar Renteria, Luis Castillo, all those guys that we brought into the organization. So it was a very difficult to leave that, but at the same time, changes of ownership, changes of everything. And Dave called me and it was kind of a no-brainer really to go to Detroit because we knew it was going to be a rebuilding situation. We already had done that in Miami. So it was a great challenge and it worked out for me. It worked out for Dave. It worked out for everybody. And it was mainly the reason it was difficult because those first couple of years were so tough in that we had to make some really tough trades of some popular players that quite frankly weren't performing anymore. And there were some issues there that we had to work through, but eventually worked out. So those are the things that made it tough. But at the same time, for me, I became a jack of all trades for Dave. I supervised some of the, obviously the amateur scouting, the minor leagues also was in a transition mode. So there was a lot of changes. So I worked with our scouting director at the time, Greg Smith. We worked in the minor leagues. I put together a lot of information at the major league level for whether it be trades or free agents. So I became a jack of all trades for Dave at that point. And that, for me, gave me a lot of experience and exposure in different areas of the game.
You mentioned the first few years were pretty difficult, but then after that, what was it like when you guys took off? I mean, you guys were really World Series contenders from pretty much 2006 to 2014. Like there were some big moves made during that time as well, like hiring Jim Leland, drafting a Justin Verlander, signing a Pudge Rodriguez, signing a Prince Fielder later on, trading for Miguel Cabrera, and of course, going to the World Series in 2006 and 2012, only to fall short both times. What do you remember about some of those moves? And then also just that stretch of great Tigers baseball?
We did have, I can't, luck sometimes falls into it, but I would say like the biggest move, obviously, as we all know, was when we signed Pudge Rodriguez. And I remember Mr. Ilitch. Mr. Ilitch was really aggressive here. He actually, I actually went on his airplane, flew to Miami, picked up Pudge and his wife, flew him back. Okay. So that's how much he wanted to make sure that we were able to do this in the right way. We treated him like royalty, really, at the end of the day. Now, when we brought him in and through the negotiations, we obviously, once the deal was agreed to, he had to take a physical. That's where really, believe it or not, that's the most difficult thing because his physical didn't go very clean. He had some issues in his back that were really alarming. And actually the physician at that time that did the physical did not recommend the science. So Mr. Ilitch kind of rolled the dice on Pudge and it worked out. So it was actually at the end of the day, his decision to, hey, Mr. Ilitch, here it is. And I remember sitting with Mr. Ilitch and with Pudge at the hospital because I basically drove him there. It was an interesting conversation. And I remember Pudge's first wife at that time, when she heard the news, she actually started crying because she was like, oh, man, this deal's never going to fall through. And it didn't. Mr. Ilitch actually said, no, we're going to do this. And we moved forward. So kind of the same thing really with Manuel Ordonez. If you remember when we signed Manuel Ordonez, he had the knee issue. He went across the world to get, some kind of new surgery that Scott Boras found out. And that was a roll of the dice to some degree because that was an unknown surgery at that time. So Mr. Ilitch decided to say, no, we're going to do it. So we did it. Now, in saying that, Dave, obviously we had good reports on Manuel because he was at that point one of the best hitters in all of baseball. That was not a question. It was more of the injury. And of course, he has the sports hernia and he's out for a long time. So that kind of delayed that. So we had to go through that. I remember taking Baglio to Canada because Mr. Ilitch had a surgeon there that did surgeries on hockey players. And he said, no, I want him there because that's my doctor. So I took him to Canada. And the greatest story about that is at that point, Matthew had a few $1 million in the bank. And we get stopped at customs and saying, what are you guys doing here? And we said, well, we're going to go see a doctor because of surgery. And they wanted to say, hey, do you have money to pay for it? Because, the medicine there is supposedly free. But if you're a foreigner coming in, you got to show proof that you can pay for it. So as Manuel Ordonez, a major league player with millions of dollars, I said, yeah, I think we had that covered. But obviously we had the, insurance. So, but anyway, so all that, are experiences that really are not normal. You know what I mean? They're just kind of like extras along the way.
It's funny, you mentioned Mr. I, Mike Ilitch, a few times there. How badly did he want to win as the owner of the Tigers at that time? And what was it like for you to work for him, chasing his dream of winning the World Series before his death in February 2017?
Obviously, Dave was one in charge there. So, he had more conversations with Mike Ilitch than I did. But at the same time, I was very involved. Obviously, I was very well taken care of by the family. And so I was involved in all the conversations. But I will tell you that he wanted to do it at all costs. He pushed the envelope as much as you can push it. I remember getting pushback from other teams in our division, really, with the commissioner's office is how come you're letting the Tigers spend so much money? Because, as you got to prove to Major League Baseball that your revenue is going to support your expenses. And you go through that process every year. It's very simple because you don't want teams to go bankrupt like the Dodgers went bankrupt, like Texas went bankrupt. So you have to go through this process. And Mr. Ilitch pushed the envelope quite a bit in order to get to that point of getting our salaries where it needed to get to get the best players we could.
You mentioned spending a lot. Can you kind of help me understand what it was like working for both Mike Ilitch and then Christopher Ilitch? I think there's a perception out there that, Mike was laser focused on winning while Chris has taken a different approach. How do you view the comparisons between the two of them, having worked for them both?
And that's a great question. And I think there's a big misconception because, there are two different styles of managing or running a team. But you have to understand one thing. Chris Ilitch wants to win as much as Mike Ilitch wants to win. It's just a different way of approaching it. Mike Ilitch, at the age that he was at, okay, and after all his accomplishments, okay, he did what he thought he needed to do at that time, and he stretched the envelope, like I mentioned, because when I took over, quite frankly, financially, we were not doing well. We were in dire straits. We were in the red. And so it was difficult to get out of that situation, which made my job coming in to be the general manager a lot tougher. And so now Chris comes in, and Chris wants to win as much as Mike Ilitch. Believe me, it's just a different way of going about it, in a more responsible fiscal way for the long term. And so, so there's a misconception there. Chris was very involved after I took over. I traveled with Chris to Latin America to show him the academy. What they're buying now, what they're building now was well planned way before. To Lakeland to meet the staff. A lot of the things that were built, I was able to build it. And then there's a lot of things that came down afterwards that was planned way before. And he was very involved in all that. The technology that was added, the analytics that was added, Chris was all on board with that and pushing it forward to get the Tigers ahead of the game, because obviously we had fallen back, right? So Chris was very involved in that process. Not to mention, I traveled with him to see Casey Mize pitch. He saw Casey Mize pitch at the University of Florida. When we drafted Jackson Jobe, we had, he knew I had Marcelo Mayer, first of my list. And then through those travels, we switched to Jackson Jobe. He was involved in all these decisions. So it's not like, no, I'm not saying he made those decisions, but he was very involved in the process, let people do their jobs, and wanted to make sure that we were on the right track. And so, hey, that's why I kept on getting those extensions, because he knew we were on the right track. He knew we were adding what we needed to add, from personnel to technology, analytics, and we were adding young players as we went along. It was just we were rebuilding, basically, so it's a different way of going about it.
When you were promoted to general manager, that was August 2015. It also coincided with Mike Ilitch firing Dave Dombrowski. Did you see all that coming? And then how did you find out that you were the one getting promoted to general manager?
Well, I was there for a long time, and so you build relationships over a period of time. And so there was a level of trust. That year was a very disappointing year for Mr. Ilitch. It was kind of like the last push, per se. And so I think he was ready to make a change, and nothing lasts forever. I can tell you that right now. After 21 years with the Tigers and 10 years with the Marlins, nothing lasts forever. Ownership changes and all that. So at some point during the season, before the trading deadline, when the decision was made to make the trades that we made and kind of start, a new process, he did reach out and say, hey, and the reason I think he reached out was because he had already made a decision. In my opinion, I think he already had made the decision to make that change at the front office. And he just wanted to make sure that if he did, I would stay on and become the general manager, because that's what he wanted. And so obviously at that point, I had to make a decision. And okay, so am I going to stay here with the organization and loyal to an owner that has taken care of me? Or am I going to say, no, I'm leaving? So I made the decision to stay. And then obviously then he made the decision afterwards.
After you get promoted, when did you realize that the Tigers needed a rebuild? And why did you decide to start the rebuild when you did? Those are two separate questions, right? When did you realize it? And then when did it actually happen?
Well, it's just like I mentioned, that same year, we kind of started the rebuild because we made some trades, but Mr. Ilitch wanted to continue to try to win the following year also. That we had more major league talent at that point. We did our best to try to keep that going. As a matter of fact, the following year, if we would have won 2 out of 3 games in Atlanta the last weekend of the season, we would have been in the playoffs. And we ended up losing 2 out of 3, which was really devastating for us. And that right there at that point, it was okay. We did it. We tried everything we could. Now we got to move on.
I think a lot of people think of the rebuild as just rebuilding the roster, but analytics, how did you go about that? How about the facilities, both in Lakeland and in the Dominican Republic? Those were certainly a big part of rebuilding the Tigers outside of just the roster. What was your experiences like with both analytics and then the facilities?
Obviously, I'm an old school guy, man. I'm not the analytical guy, but I knew where we were at from a business perspective compared to the rest of the league. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know, because even at the college level, they were so advanced. And the things that we were seeing is high school players, the high schools don't have the same resources that colleges do. Colleges have so much money now, but the high schools don't. So what were high school players doing, or players that were going into high school? They were getting private lessons from guys that build their own systems. And quite frankly, the technology and the analytics that they went to business on their own. So you had young players doing that. And then you had, obviously going into college, and they were already so far advanced. And then, of course, then baseball catches on and it explodes. So my first, I remember when I took over, the first guy that came to me was Verlander. He says, hey, I went into the bullpen of the Houston Astros and look at all the stuff that they've got. And I'm like, well, you know what? I just took over. So give me some time. And I promise you, all right, we're going to get to that point. But it doesn't happen overnight. I'm sorry. But that's just the way it is. And now the thing is, we do have guys that had a lot of experience, myself included, because sometimes what you see with your eyes, the analyst will confirm, which is a great thing, and vice versa. So we were able to help a lot of players without the analytics. Obviously, we did a lot of winning without the analytics, not to mention without the technology. So, but at the same time, once I came in, and I talked, and at that time, Chris was getting a little bit more involved because obviously Mr. Ilitch was getting older and all that. And so we were locked in as far as what we needed to do to add not only analytics, but the technology. And my first hire at that point was Jace Jung, which actually he's the one that led he was the guy that was really knowledgeable about that. I couldn't have done that because that was not my expertise, but I was smart enough to hire the right people to get us to where we needed to get to. And Chris was on board. And obviously he spent a lot of money. Now it took time. And probably the hardest thing for me was trying, because I had loyalty there. I had a lot of staff, player development, scouting that were old school guys. And part of the biggest difficulty was to get them to start to open their minds to the analytics, to the new technology, to use it, to be taught to use the new technology. And that integration was very difficult at the beginning. I remember speaking to several general managers that went through that process, and they told me it takes time because some guys are going to be more open to it than other guys. And the ones that are will survive. The ones that aren't will not survive. And that was explained very well to the staff. And that transition actually is what took the longest.
There are two trades from the rebuild that we have to talk about: Justin Verlander, JD Martinez. Walk us through, what was it actually like trying to trade those guys in 2017?
In JD's case, and people just don't believe this, is, you didn't have any imagination of how to trade. There was no market. Basically, every single team, and then it's just, we're trying to, the only thing that we could have done differently was kept them and then get a draft pick, which I think at that point would have been somewhere between maybe the 4th, 5th round. And we knew that the players that we were going to get back were not great players, but we thought they were young enough. I mean, I think Dal Lugo was having a good year. There were certain guys there, and even Keane, who was only 18 years old, they were prospects. And I think people thought that we were going to get more. And so, but when you don't have a market, the only thing you can do, and some general managers would have done it, just kept the guy and, roll the dice in the draft. I felt that we got 3 players that are young. One of them might, we have a better shot of getting one through to the big leagues than the 5th round pick at that time. That's really the way it ended up. It was very difficult for me to trade JD Martinez because he was like a son to me. I remember, I knew him since he was a little kid. My brother coached him. I was part of the process that brought him to the Tigers. I went that winter to Dave Dombrowski and said, I would like to trade for JD Martinez. He said, go ahead, call him up. They didn't want to trade him. They took him to the end. So, that was a very difficult trade for me to do. But at the end of the day, I figured 3 young prospects, you have a better chance of a 5th round pick because there was the other 29 clubs, there's no interest at all. And I know people find it hard to swallow, but that's just the way it was. And with Verlander, it's a little different because with Verlander, obviously he was coming back from injuries where now he was starting to pitch really well. And so, again, here's a situation where Verlander had no trade clause. So, and I'm very close with Justin. Him and Alex are best friends. So that was another difficult one, because you get attached to him. So I kept him informed from day one of, what we were trying to do here. And he says, well, if you can, I'd like to go either the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Cubs. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, the Dodgers said no. The Yankees said no. If the Dodgers would have taken him to trade that year, they probably would have won the World Series. Truth be told, right? But they said no. The Yankees said no. The only teams that had a little interest were the Cubs. But the Cubs at that time didn't really have the players, nor did they have the money, more importantly, really, to pay whatever, they needed to pay for the remainder of his salary at that point. You did everything you could. And you get a phone call I remember leaving the office that afternoon, and Justin comes up and he says, any news? And I said, no phone calls, nothing. It's been pretty quiet. And here's, we're on the 31st and it's 6:00 in the afternoon. So for some reason, the trading deadline, it's at 12 midnight, which that's changed now, thank God. And so I said, if anything comes up tonight, I'll let you know. So I got my staff and I said, let's go to my house. My wife is a great cook, so she's going to cook dinner. We'll have dinner. We'll hang out. And as opposed to hanging out here in the office, and we'll just wait there to see if anything happens. We get a phone call at 11:30 at night, or 11. It was late. And so I remember calling Chris Ilitch at that time. I got a phone call from Houston. And that trade really at the end of the day was a good trade. We got good players. Franklin Perez doesn't get hurt. He's probably in our rotation today. Or in the Tigers rotation today. But unfortunately, the injuries do happen. So now at least, Jake Rogers turned out to be a decent player and he'll be there for a long time. So, but at the end of the day, the reason that deal got done so late was because Jeff Luhnow, who was the general manager at that time, had no interest in Verlander. The interest came by a push of A.J. Hinch with the owner. And the owner got involved. The owner actually talked to Justin Verlander because I let him.
Jim Crane.
All right. To convince him to go. And that's how it ended up, So at the end of the day, if you read some of the reports, the players we got back were pretty good. And at that time, we really needed to move the salary, and we were hoping to get the best players possible. Now, in saying that, moving a future Hall of Famer is not the easiest thing to do, because for me, obviously, and I told Justin this, I said, Justin, this is not the easiest trade in the world. You're going to be a Hall of Famer, and I'm going to be responsible for trading this. So there's a lot of my shoulders here. But hey, we talked it through, and it happened, and the rest is history.
We'll have more on Days of Roar in our interview with former Tigers general manager Al Avila after this break. I remember at the press conference that Chris Ilitch had after you were fired, he was asked about the Justin Verlander trade, the JD Martinez trade, and he said that he didn't trade those players. He said our general manager did, referring to you. Do you think that those two trades, the returns, did those impact the timeline for the rebuild? And then also, do you think that maybe even the returns from those trades ultimately sealed the deal for you as the general manager when all was said and done?
No, I think really at the end of the day, Chris really didn't believe that was an effect, because we never really expected a lot back from JD Martinez. If you look at the history of that kind of player being traded at the trade deadline, there's usually not a big return. All you have to do is research it, and you'll see that there's not a lot of big return. Where a player that was injured, yeah, he was actually hitting pretty well at that time, but last year of his contract, the defensive situation where it was an offensive player, you don't usually get a big return. I think that the criticism there was really unwarranted. I think Chris realized that. Never put that on me behind the scenes at all. As a matter of fact, our biggest worry really was Verlander, because, the status that he had. But at the end of the day, that was our highest, his salary at that time, we had to move it. And the players that we were getting back at that time were legitimate players. I mean, Daz Cameron they had given him $4.5 million, just a couple years before, and he was having a good year. And I think Franklin was their number 3 overall top guy. So it wasn't like we got, anything. I mean, we got a pretty good package. So he never really put any blame on me on that. And I don't think that was a reason why I would have got let go by any means. I think even Chris behind the scenes never really blamed me, or, he was fine with all that.
I want to get into some draft questions because you drafted some good players and had to make some tough decisions along the way. The two ones that stand out the most, Casey Mize, Spencer Torkelson as the number 1 overall picks in 2018 and 2020. What did you like about Casey Mize in 2018, and what did you like about Spencer Torkelson in 2020?
With Casey Mize, for me, there was a few things. Number one is he had a very good fastball that he had command of. The split finger was a swing and miss pitch, which actually he struggled with it a little bit later after we drafted him. But the split finger was a major league pitch. He had a major league fastball. He had the makings of slider, curveball, changeup. So he had really a good mix of pitches, but at the same time, he also had the right makeup. We always looked at the makeup. And one of the things that I remember talking to Chris about it, a lot was the makeup of the player. And when I say the makeup of the player is a player that will work through adversity, whether it be a slump or whether it be an injury. Okay. which Casey Mize did. So it tells you we got the right guy. We had the right information because he was one of the top pitchers in the draft that year. At least for me, he was the top guy. I remember, well, to my point earlier, I took Chris to say, this is the guy we're going to take. And I took him to watch him pitch. Unfortunately, Jonathan India hit a home run off of him that day, but that stuff happens. But it was more about, we knew that the athletic ability there, the pitching ability was there, the swing and miss pitch was there. Is more about the makeup of the player. And as a matter of fact, I've had conversations with him over that, his struggles with the injuries. And when they were here in Miami, I said hello to him. He says, "Hey, thank you for believing in me." And I said, "Well, the thing is, I believed in you, but you proved it." And those are the kind of things that are beautiful when you see them develop. With Torkelson, let me just tell you something. We were very lucky that we were able to get Torkelson. As a matter of fact, I think Dingler was also in that draft, the second pick. But we almost didn't have a draft that year because of COVID, if you remember. All right. So Torkelson really, here's a guy that in college, the season was cut short. He played a handful of games. So that development already set him back, not to mention all the players of that draft. But the thing about that year was the commissioner was basically thinking, and there was a lot of owners that didn't want to have a draft because obviously there was, you're not playing, there's no money coming in, you're not making money. So the thought was no draft. Let's wait till next year. And I remember going to Chris and I said, "Chris, our team right now, our organization right now, if we don't have a draft, it's going to even delay further the development of our young players." I said, "We have right now the opportunity to get the best hitter in the entire draft." So for me, it was a no-brainer because he was the best hitter in the draft that year, and not too much, with the power. So I said, if we don't do that, we don't know if we're going to get a bat like that next year. And so I said, it's imperative that we have a draft. Ideally, I would like to have at least 20 a 20 round draft, but we put together a memo that was about, I don't know how many pages long it was, to the commissioner expressing the reason why we thought we needed to have a draft that year. And there was other teams in a rebuilding mode like us, they actually did the same. And so it was decided finally by MLB to have a 5-round draft. And so that process in itself was, it took weeks to make sure that we had a draft. We almost didn't even have a draft. But for me, he was the best hitter in the draft that year. Obviously, he was a first baseman. We thought we'd give him a shot at third base. That's why we drafted him as a third baseman. That didn't work out. We went back to first base. It took him a while because the development, because of COVID, his development was not as smooth, let's say, as past players.
I also want to ask about your last 2 drafts. Jackson Jobe at number 3 in 2021, taking him instead of Marcelo Mayer. And then in 2022, you took Jace Jung at number 12 rather than Zach Neto. What did you like about the decision to take Jackson Jobe over Marcelo Mayer and then Jace Jung over Zach Neto?
With Jobe and Marcelo, before I saw Jackson Jobe, Marcelo Mayer on my personal list was number 1. All right, I had him on my list. Area scouts have their list. The regional cross checkers have their list. The national guys have their list. It finally gets to me, then I make my own list, right? So I had Marcelo on the number 1. Chris knew it too, and then the guys basically said, the cross checkers in particular, they were high on Jobe. And so I remember that was probably the longest road trip I ever taken. It was like, I took a taxi, air flight, rental car. I mean, it was like a long, long trip. And I saw him and, get people say, well, he never hit 100. Well, he did hit 100 miles an hour. Yeah, for me. And the spin rate was there. We were able to measure the spin rate. So when I looked at him, I remember drafting Josh Beckett. Okay. Back then, I didn't have the technology to know about Josh Beckett's spin rate, but I can see his 12-6 curveball, the way that ball spins in my eyes, it looked pretty darn good. And Josh Beckett was consistently 97, 98, hit 99 as a high school player. Now, Beckett was 19 years old when we drafted him. Joe was 18. Joe was hitting 100 when Beckett was hitting 99. And I was able to not only see the spin rate on Joe, but I was able to also have the technology and analytics to back it all up. And again, so we felt that he's going to be a special guy. For me, he's going to be a number 1 starter. He's got that kind of ability. So then the second thing comes in, the makeup. Okay, well, Marcelo Mayer's tremendous makeup, so I had no issues with that. That's why he was number one on my list. Okay, I felt he was going to be, a good major league player, but I felt that Jobe was going to be a little bit more special, and the makeup was there. The family support was there. Obviously, his father being a pro golfer and all that, so that all kind of lined up. I remember calling Chris Ilitch from the baseball field, from the high school field out there in Oklahoma. And I said, okay, so, he knows I had Marcelo Mayer. I said, I'm switching to Jackson Jobe. And I said, no, we still have to go in the room. We have to still go and do our meetings and all that. And if it still turns out that way, then, so, you give yourself the opportunity to change your mind down the road. But at that point, I did call him up and I said I was very excited to see Jobe and I thought that he might be the guy. So that was it. With Jace Jung, it was a difficult thing. With Neto, I can't tell you too much about Neto, although obviously we liked his athleticism. I think we thought that Jace had a better chance to hit. He was actually one of the top college hitters that year. It's funny that I mentioned this draft because that was my last draft. I traveled, just tried to see him a couple of times, rained out, taking commercial flights that were canceled. I mean, the weather was terrible that year. And I remember Chris calling me up and says, hey, I got a private jet, get on that and go. And I did. I got there, I saw batting practice, I saw the games, and then I had to come back because we had a game that day. And so once we got into the draft room, at the end of the day, the consensus was we felt that Jace Jung is going to hit and hit with power. So we did have concerns of what position he was going to play. There's no doubt. But at the end of the day, I think he was injured that year. He didn't move very well. And I remember seeing him. I was concerned. And they were, he's got this injury. And I forgot what the injury was. I think it was to his knee or something like that. He wasn't running very well. But so if there's any concern, it was more of the defense than anything.
I cannot ask you about drafts without asking you about the 2019 draft because there were just so many great players in that draft. Adley Rutschman, Bobby Witt Jr., Riley Greene, CJ Abrams, Josh Jung, Alek Manoah, Corbin Carroll, George Kirby, and that's just the first round. I mean, there were so many great players in the 2019 draft. What did you like about Riley Greene there as opposed to, say, a CJ Abrams?
For me that year, I liked Bobby Witt Jr. the best. That was my guy, but I knew for a fact he wasn't going to get to us. As a matter of fact, I went to see him, and I remember Dayton Moore being at the game, and he's like, why are you here? I'm like, well, I did. I said, I just wanted to lay my eyes on him. That's it, So, wistful thinking. But also we like Rutschman too a lot. Those are probably the guys that were highest on our list at the time. But at the end of the day, okay, so Riley Greene was I think he was the best high school hitter in that draft. And we knew him the best of all the players that you just mentioned. Why? Because, we had R.J. Burgess, who was our area guy, James Orr, who knew Riley, who was our cross-checker at that time, knew Riley since he was a little kid, knew the father, knew the process of, the father was a hitting coach. So he had a batting cage, the whole bit. So we knew him since he was a kid. We knew the makeup. We felt he was going to hit. So it was a matter of the trust. And so if, you like two players and this guy better than this guy, you're going to take the guy that the best. As long as obviously you know that the ability is there, that's at the end of the day, that's how we make that decision.
Getting away from the draft and getting into some trades, trading Daniel Norris for Reese Olson in 2021 at the deadline, that turned out to be like a sneaky, excellent trade for the Tigers. Who recommended Reese Olson, and what do you remember about the decision to acquire him? And then what was it like actually getting him into the organization and now seeing what he's become when he's able to stay on the field and be healthy?
He's one of the guys that we were in our war room or trading room in the office there at the stadium. And analytically speaking, obviously our guys liked him because he had that spin rate, he had that velo. Our biggest concern was, he wasn't a real physical guy. But I think that's one of the few times that, not one of the few times, but one of the times where scouting reports and the analytics kind of combine and say, hey, this guy's major league pitcher basically. And so we kind of stuck to that. And really, at the end of the day, that was probably the best deal we can make. There was hardly any interest really in anywhere to go anywhere else at that point. But it just shows that at that time, Milwaukee really needed a left-handed reliever at that point, and Daniel, and they liked him a lot. And it was just a matter of holding on to the very end, because I remember just making the decision, if we don't get result, this is how it happened. If we don't get result, we're not going to make a trade, because we didn't like anybody else. It was one of those things, you learn a little bit as you go along, and you're saying, okay, you know what, this is it. I'm not going to take any more, punches. This is how it's going to go. And I remember driving home that evening. I got home about 12 midnight. And I think it was around 12:30, almost 1 o'clock in the morning. And I get a call from their general manager, and I was out with the Mets. And I just said, look, I'm going to bed. This is the guy we want. You want to make the trade? You got it. If not, then I'm going to bed. That's the way it happened. And so he made a deal.
How did you also know when it was the right time to add veterans to the young players? We talked about some of the guys that you drafted, Torkelson, a Greene. Obviously, you drafted Dylan Dingler and Parker Meadows as well. How did you know when the time was right to add veterans to the young core? And why did you think the offseason leading into the 2022 season was the time to do that with Tucker Barnhart, Austin Meadows, Eduardo Rodriguez, Javier Báez? Why then?
First of all, when I hired AJ, okay, one of the things, and I know you were going to ask that question at some point, but one of the things that we discussed was, are we going to add to that young nucleus? AJ did a good job in kind of researching our farm system and our young players, and he was bullish on them. He thought we had a pretty good nucleus, but he also asked before we hired him, will we add when we have to add? And, are we going to spend money or what? Or we're just trying to just roll the dice with these guys? And I said, no, I know for a fact we would add and we will spend money. The conversation was, oh, you're going to do it this year when you hire me? I'm like, no, we're not ready yet. Okay. But it's coming. It might be next year, and that's kind of how it happened. We did feel that those young guys, were ready to step up. We knew there was going to be some development time at the major league level, which there always is. But that's why it's okay. We got to add some veteran guys to surround these young guys. And then we're going to have a good mix of veteran guys with young guys. And the veteran guys that we added really weren't really that old. They were, they're seasoned veterans, but they're not guys that they're at the end of their careers either. So it was guys that we felt we can, keep for a while.
Yeah, you mentioned spending big. We'll get into Javier Báez and what happened there, but the big spend would have been Carlos Correa. I believe it was 10 years, $275 million. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the offer out there that he turned down. What did you think about how all that happened? Did you ever go to Chris Ilitch to say, hey, can we get $300 million or even more to try to make that happen? And then after you missed out on Correa, did you ever consider just not signing a shortstop and rolling into the season with Ryan Kreidler, because he was on the rise at that time as well? How did you see that shake out before we get into Javi Báez?
With Correa, obviously him and AJ Hinch had a great relationship, and we were trying whatever we can do to acquire him that year. But there's other players obviously that we looked at too, and you go into the offseason basically with a budget. Okay. And trying to, accomplish your needs within that budget. No team goes in there and just, spends money crazily. When you make a budget, you're making it based on your projected revenues. That's how every team operates. Okay. Then down the road, if you need to make an adjustment here and there, that's what you do. And you do that with the entire organization. How much you spend in the minor leagues and player development, how much you spend in scouting, amateur scouting, pro scouting, how much you spend in your analytics department, adding personnel. You go in with a budget, you add personnel. Same thing with the major league roster. Obviously, that's the biggest expense of any team. So you go into it like that. And so with Correa, we're trying to be creative as far as see where he would go. But it was obviously to me and to us as an organization that what his expectations were well beyond what I was comfortable with at that time. That never developed. And it's true of, other guys. With Javi Báez, yeah, the only thing that we could have done differently was not sign him and go on with with Kreidler in there. But at the end of the day, I didn't think that would help us win, and we were trying to win. So, I love Kreidler. I drafted Kreidler. He tremendous makeup, good defense. I think he's a good baseball player. I think he'll play, for a long time, and maybe it's going to be more of a utility role. I don't know, but I certainly didn't feel that going into the season with Kreidler at shortstop was going to be a winning combination. So I don't see Javi Báez as a roll of the dice by any means, because Javi Báez was an established major league player. Yeah. Did he have a bad year? Was there a little bit of a decline? Yeah, but he was still a young player that, had still, in our opinion, he still had a future and he was a major league quality player. I mean, there's a big difference between Javi Baez and going in with, a guy like Kreidler or quite frankly, any other rookie like that. And it's not like we had, a premium shortstop ready to go. So that's how we ended up with Javi Baez. Now, unfortunately, he had a terrible year. He played through some injury, probably affected his swing. I don't know that he went into that season in the best shape that he could have been. I think it took him a while, to tell you the truth, to get used to Detroit. I think he came from the Cubs and which that tremendous success. He was a Chicago guy. He loved being there. And for a player, sometimes, especially, Latin players, but sometimes that transition really takes some time to get used to. But yeah, he goes to the Mets and obviously, there's a Latin culture there. They had success. So he comes to Detroit. I don't know that he was 100% ready to be there. And it took a little while. And I got to give credit to AJ Hinch to really, number one, obviously he got to know Javi very well. He went to Puerto Rico and really worked with him in order to get that turnaround. And I think that was part of the process of getting him healthy, getting his mind in the right direction. And I think Javi Baez right now is very happy in Detroit and he feels he's going to be a winner there. And I got to give a lot of credit to AJ for that. And Javi himself, I think it eventually came around and figured it out.
What do you remember about the process of signing Javi Baez? Because I know that gets put on you. And yes, it was you who signed the guy. But at the same time, didn't you and AJ Hinch travel the country meeting with potential shortstops, including Javi? Didn't Chris Ilitch send the private jet to Puerto Rico? What was that whole experience like as everything unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, AJ and I had traveled extensively throughout the country. We talked to Marcus Semien. We talked to several guys as far as trying to land a shortstop. And it was a priority. So at the end of the day, it ended up being Javi because that was we had a list. We had a list of 5 guys and it ended up being Javi. And so again, it was either going to be Javi Baez or to your point, Kreidler or somebody like that. So, it was kind of a no-brainer to sign Javi at that point because we're trying to win. We're trying to bring in a major league player to take us to the next level. We didn't think the contract was going to be as bad as it looks that first couple of years. But at the end of the day, obviously, he's made good on it here from last year. But yeah, well, it was late at night. I want to say it was probably 11:30, 11 o'clock Chris sent him a private jet to pick him up and his wife because we need to do the physical. It was the same time as his birthday.
And the lockout was coming.
He had already had made plans to take his family on a vacation. So it was all that combined. So we needed to send a private plane to get him in and out. And, Chris, if you call Chris, say, I need this, he's going to give it to you. So it's not like, how much does that cost? It doesn't work that way. This is Major League Baseball and it's run in a first class way.
We'll take a quick break. Then it's back to our conversation with former Tigers general manager Al Avila on Days of Roar. I do want to get your take on just the 2022 season as a whole. Obviously, Spencer Torkelson makes his MLB debut, and it sucked when Riley Greene went down with that injury in spring training, the foul ball off his foot, and he ends up missing a bunch of time. It just felt like everything that could have gone wrong that year went wrong, whether it was Eduardo Rodriguez, whether it was Austin Meadows, whether it was Javi Baez, whether it was the struggles of Torkelson or Riley Greene with the injury. Did it feel like as that season was going on, I don't know, could you feel like the walls closing in on you? Could you feel like, oh my gosh, what's the next thing that's going to go wrong here? Because it did really seem like everything that could go wrong went wrong.
Well, I will tell you that the 2 toughest seasons that I ever had in my career, and I worked 40 years in Major League Baseball, 41, was 2002 when I moved to Detroit. That first year, we went through hell and back that first year. And then that year that was probably my worst. Well, since I was in charge, it was probably worse because it was all on me. So it did take a toll on me, to tell you the truth. I've never experienced anything like that. A pitcher going AWOL. I was in shock. And I remember when we signed him, we were so happy because, everybody was happy. We signed a really good pitcher, I also know there was other teams heavy, on him. Intel that I had that led us to go to where we went to that contract. And so for that to happen is you start thinking, how does that happen? But it did. And we did everything possible to get him on the team. We would have, we offered so much support that he just kind of rejected and stayed home. And I understand sometimes that he put his kids in front, which, most of us would do. And so he made a decision that he felt that was best for his family. So I can't blame him on that one. And so with Austin Meadows, again, those are situations that you try to work through, but they're unfortunate. And you try to help as much as you can in those situations, obviously. And injuries are going to happen. You have to overcome them. Roddy gets hurt. Yep. I remember, years before, J.D. Martinez got hurt and banged himself. He was out for 6 weeks, 7 weeks that year, the year we traded him. So that was not, those were things that are going to happen. But to your point, a lot of things happened that year that just didn't go our way. And I think that really at the end of the day was, it took a toll with everybody, not just me. And I go back with Torkelson again. His development was really interrupted with COVID and all that, because hitters you can say the same thing for Casey Mize, but hitters are obviously, they need the repetition more than anybody. And I think he was the one that suffered the most with the lack of development time that it caused.
With all that piling up, when did you get a sense that you were going to be fired in 2022? And how did you find out from Chris Ilitch? And during that time, did Chris ever offer you a chance to resign on your own or stay with the Tigers in a different role? Like, you had to take all the blame for what happened, and it cost your job, understandably so. But when did you get a sense it was going to happen, and how did you find out?
I've been around for a long time, and I've seen guys come and go in different circumstances. That season, from my experience in the past, I said to myself, this is not going well. I just got an extension too. So it's not like, it was going to be an easy decision either. And I don't think anybody saw that type of year coming, including Chris, to tell you the truth, or AJ Hinch for that matter. I remember sitting down with AJ and we're just looking at each other and said, how is this happening? But it did. And so I had a sense that it could happen. I felt, I got an extension not too long ago. Maybe, they'll give me another year because there was that nucleus of players that we trusted. It's just overcoming this year and let's get to the next year. But I did get a sense just on my own that it could happen. And then Chris, came to me. I forget exactly. I think it might have been in August. I forget the date, but I think it might have been in August that he came to me and said he was going to make a decision. And I couldn't blame him. He was getting criticized for keeping me. And I think he held on as long as he could. So I couldn't blame him. He did offer me an opportunity to resign and actually stay on, as an advisor, consultant, whatever. At my age, it would have probably been a good move. But at the end of the day, I said, no, I think I don't want to really stick around because, number one, I don't want to be that guy on the side that sticks. I'd rather you have a clean slate. I don't want to resign because I brought a lot of people in this organization that, quite frankly, I feel like I would let them down if I resigned. And I'm very loyal to my people. And I say, I don't want to do that. And looking back, would I have made a different decision? I don't know. But at that time, I was adamant about, I felt I would be letting down the people that I brought into the organization, especially the newer ones, that if I resigned. And I didn't want to stick around. He offered me that. I didn't want to stick around and be that guy in the corner. You bring in a new general manager and, you're just, what are you doing? I figured, and we had a good conversation. And quite frankly, I helped him actually put together a list of possible candidates. He actually asked me, we went together. We talked together about, where the Tigers were and where it's going. Cause obviously he's going to try to get the best guy out there. And what am I selling? I said, well, you're selling a really good nucleus of young players that are basically ready to win by just making a few moves here and there. We just got to get over this bad period, and which obviously worked out. And so I said, you got the best fan base, tremendous fan base. You got potential revenue coming in. We had taken the payroll to the point where we were not losing money. Now, in saying that, all the money that the Tigers made, Chris invested it in the Tigers. And make no mistake about it, because he gave me money to get the players, at the major league level, and he invested, every penny back into the Tigers, whether it be analytics, technology, the improvements in Lakeland, the Dominican Republic, all that was in there. So whatever else is out there, baloney because, I mean, I know for a fact because I was part of that. A lot of things that are going now, the renovation of the stadium, the clubhouse, all that stuff, those were all planned way ahead. And those were investments in the organization for the long term. So you have all that to sell. Okay. And he made a great decision. I thought Scott Harris, as a matter of fact, I texted him. I said, you hit a home run. And so the rest is history and they're doing very well. And I think they're going to do great. And to your point earlier on, I think they're going to be winners in 2026 and for years to come.
Well, arguably your biggest non-player move during your tenure was hiring AJ Hinch, and you referenced that a little bit ago, but that happened in October of 2020. What do you remember about that process? Did you interview other candidates? Did you think AJ was going to go to the White Sox? And then, when did you realize, okay, like we really got a chance to land this guy? What was all that like? How was the interview process with Chris Ilitch? Obviously, AJ was coming off a suspension for the Astros sign stealing scandal. That was a really big deal. And that was a pretty important time for the Tigers. And I think you had a home run there.
Yeah, well, obviously, I got to know AJ through Scott Greene pretty well over the years. And, I felt he was probably the best manager in baseball, certainly one of the best candidates. That year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we probably interviewed maybe 20 people. It was the most I've ever interviewed as an assistant GM or as a GM. And saying that because we had a lot of time because obviously we had to wait for AJ to get through his situation. So he was the last guy. But I remember making the comment because I was asked, the first thing I was asked is, are you going to consider AJ Hinch? And I said, yes. As a matter of fact, he's on the top of the list. I remember getting hate mail from people all over. Can't believe you're considering hiring a cheater and this and that. So believe me, I got some phone calls. I got some hate mail that were really stupid. And so just some people, sometimes they're just uneducated or ignorant, whatever. They just don't understand the situation. But anyway, so I was adamant that obviously we're going to interview him. And if we have a chance then to hire him, we would. If we didn't hire AJ, I would have probably hired Mark Kotsay, to tell you the truth. But I know we drafted Kotsay in the first round in Miami with the Marlins, and I felt obviously very high on him and knew him very well. I think he would have probably been the guy. I like Phil Nevin a lot. I still have a great relationship with Nevin, although me and Nevin were very close. So I don't know if that would have worked out the best for me, but he was very high on my list too. But we interviewed, I think, almost 20 guys. But at the end of the day, because we knew the interest that the White Sox had in AJ. And at that time, I think they were a little bit more advanced, obviously, closer to winning than we were. And so there was a concern there, but I had AJ in my office, and if you've been in my office when I was there, I don't know about now, I had TVs all over the place because we used to follow all the minor league games and stuff. And so I'm watching the news, baseball news, and they're making AJ's in front of my desk, and they're making an announcement of their hire, and it was like, oh, here we go. And so AJ found out the same day I found out, that the White Sox were going on a different direction. So, but we were already talking, basically getting hot. We were talking about the job, and I felt that I still had a chance to hire him, even if the White Sox still called him. But they made that decision. So we kind of lucked out on that, where we ended up making that. We actually hashed it out right then and there. I called Chris Ilitch, and I told him my conversation with AJ. He agreed to everything, and we moved on.
Another really big hire that I don't want fans to forget was Ryan Garko to lead the player development department. That happened in September 2021. What stood out to you about him during the interview process, and what did he do to reshape player development with the Tigers? And this is a little bit more random, but do you think Ryan Garko could be a general manager or a president of baseball operations one day? I feel like he could, but you would know better than I would.
Well, I've made that comment before. As a matter of fact, when I hired him, I made that comment, and then after that, I make that comment. He comes from the same mold of AJ Hinch. He was a major league player. And I remember when he played with the Cleveland Indians. Every time he came out the bat, I even told him, I said, I got nervous when you came out the bat because I felt you could hit one out of the ballpark at any given time. And so, he's a major league player that basically, which is really the kind of the new wave right now, where they're highly educated in analytics and the new technology. because they grew up with it. They know how to use the technology to make players better. They know how to use analytics to make good decisions. But at the same time, they have the experience that they played in the minor leagues. They played in the big leagues. They have player major league experience with the education. Perfect combination for a guy to lead an organization. And that was Garco. But not only that, he already had some experience at the major league level, coaching at the major league level with the Angels, obviously, and he was highly regarded. But at the same time, he also had a good network of people that he was ready to bring in. He brought in Gabe Rivas, who's pitching coach now, made a big difference in that. Rysienko, who now is at the major league level, brought him into the minor leagues. Our AA manager, I think, was Gabe Alvarez, winning and Erie. So he brought in good people that were basically, from that mold per se. So the experience, the knowledge, the network of people that he was going to be able to bring in, it was kind of a no-brainer. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world when I hired him. And I told him, I said, my biggest fear is that somebody's going to try to hire you away from here. And I remember talking to him almost on a regular basis because I was like, I got to keep this guy happy. And one of the biggest decisions that I made was because I wanted him to move to Lakeland. And he said, no, I need to stay here in California because I got my family, but I'll be and he travels. Guys always travel. So yeah, he was one of my favorite hires of all time.
I can't believe we've gotten this far and I still haven't mentioned the name Tarik Skubal. Let's dig into that and then we'll get you out of here. When did you first hear the name Tarik Skubal? And when did you realize that Tarik Skubal was not just a 9th round pick, but he had a chance to be a very special pitcher?
Yeah, and these situations happen from time to time in baseball, if it's just the way it is. Tarik Skubal was a guy that we had followed since high school. Dave Dangler, who was an area guy, knew him from high school. Actually, I think he might have even known him before high school, but I know he knew him in high school. He really wasn't like a high-end prospect at that point. Obviously, he went to Seattle University, the only team that offered him a scholarship, Division I school anyway. And so it wasn't like he was a high-end prospect at any time, but he was a guy because he was a big guy, left-handed pitcher. So you're always on top of those kind of guys. So we had follow reports on him all the way through high school. Okay. Obviously he had Tommy John surgery. He comes back from Tommy John surgery the following year, right? So he's pitching. And then the first half of that season, he didn't pitch all that well at the beginning. And then all of a sudden, that's when usually when you have teams up north, that's when the scouts or the cross checkers come in, at the beginning of the season. If you don't go back and double check or you don't have the time, you might miss out. And that's why you also need more eyes on the ground sometimes. And that's where good scouting comes in, where sometimes the analytics doesn't help you. And so there's boots on the ground here. So all of a sudden, the second half of the season, he pitches much better. Velo goes up, and actually, he's performing. So we're in the draft room, and we'll get to the 9th round. And if you've ever been in a draft room, sometimes your board explodes after the 5th round. And you're just traveling, it's like that. You can talk to anybody in baseball and that draft board blows up pretty fast. So we're in the 9th round and we're considering different guys. And like we always do, and most teams do, you start calling your area scouts and some of the guys that you have in the different tournaments for more ideas. Okay. And so we're all in the draft room and we're listening. We had 2 guys there. We had Dangler there and we had another guy there. And we were saying, guys, we got this guy that we've been following since high school. He's 6'4", 220. He's throwing 94, 95 miles an hour. At that time, he was throwing 94, 95 miles an hour. He's got a curveball. He's got a changeup. He's got the makings of, 4 major league pitches. Great makeup, workhorse. And this is, I can't see anybody better than this guy now here in this round. And we really put it all together, and it was not an easy decision, but it was an easy decision based on that information. And again, a guy that we knew since high school with follow reports, the makeup, the work ethic, which obviously, if you know Tarik Skubal, the makeup, the work ethic, if it wasn't for the makeup and the work ethic, he wouldn't be as good as he is right now. He's throwing 100 miles an hour and stuff like that. He's a beast. And so that's how we made that decision. When did we know he was going to be a different guy? When he came into the minor leagues that first year, because he took off. The velo went up, and so it just clicked. And, he got to the big leagues pretty fast. So once we got him after that 1 year, things clicked up for him, and the development came fast. And I think it was part of the process of coming back from Tommy John surgery, working physically, and then obviously coming into the system and learning new things that he just took off fast. So we knew it right away.
One thing I wonder about Tarik Skubal is the 2022 trade deadline. It was just before he got injured in Minneapolis, if you remember. And there was a headline from Ken Rosenthal with The Athletic. The headline was, Tigers willing to trade Tarik Skubal and just about everyone, sources say. That was the headline from Ken Rosenthal with The Athletic. That was July 26th, 2022. And then he suffered the elbow injury on August 1st, 2022. And that was the day before the trade deadline. And then you were fired later that month in August. Were you just listening, or were you actually engaged in real talks there at the 2022 trade deadline with Tarik Skubal?
No. Sometimes things like that get written because you have conversations that are not really in depth by any means. But if you get a phone call from a general manager, or one of your assistants gets a phone call from one of his contemporaries, and things are thrown out all the time. And so were there conversations, were there discussions, were there ideas thrown around? Sure. But I can't tell you right now that I can tell you there was never anything close to being a trade by any means. It's just normal conversations that you have on any player. And if you're just looking at to make things better, you have to listen. But at the end of the day, one of the guys actually that we almost traded was Rodriguez, because he hadn't pitched. And we were trying to get him to start working out because we did have an interest on an organization, and then the guy didn't show up. The guy didn't show up for the workout. So it's like, okay, so how can you trade a guy who hasn't pitched and didn't show up for the workout? But those were more stories of trying to trade a guy than Tarik Skubal for that matter.
I also want to ask you about something that is happening this week. We have a precedent-setting arbitration hearing. That's Wednesday, February 4th, between Tarik Skubal and the Tigers. What can you tell us about what an arbitration hearing is like after you experienced it with Michael Fulmer in 2019? And what do you expect to happen here with Tarik Skubal filing at $32 million and the Tigers filing at $19 million? That's the largest gap in arbitration history in baseball.
That's a tough one. When I saw those numbers, I was like, well, how does that happen? But that's Scott Boras for you. You know what I mean? He'll
right on.
I gotta say that probably the way Scott looks at it is probably like, well, what do we have to lose? At the end of the day, and Tarik is a beast. I mean, he's worth every dime. But arbitration is what it is. The team is it's a business. It's a business thing. I remember talking to Michael Fulmer. Michael Fulmer, how can you not like this guy? The guy is one of the greatest guys in the world, and you love the guy. But from a business perspective, okay, this is what you got to do. You make an offer based on what you feel, because you have your analytics, you have your the work that your team put together in building where you get to that dollar amount, and so do they. And so, there's a disagreement. That doesn't mean you don't like the player. That doesn't mean you don't believe in the player. None of that stuff. All that, that personal stuff is not there. It's just more of a business. This is where the numbers go, which in today's world, there's certain players that don't like it because they're saying, well, that's baloney because I'm better than that. Well, that's your opinion and it's respected. But at the end of the day, every team has a formula that they will go through. And they have a formula for arbitration. They have a formula for trades, and they have a formula, quite frankly, to sign free agent players. So when you follow that formula, that's where it takes you. But there's nothing personal there.
I also want to ask just about the Tarik Skubal situation in general, because you have kind of been through similar things. You mentioned JD Martinez and Justin Verlander earlier, and I know that was rebuilding mode. It's different than winning mode. But how do the Tigers approach this with Tarik Skubal being a free agent after 2026? Do you trade him? Do you let him walk? Do you wait and see and find out what your team is really made of in 26 and maybe push that decision to the trade deadline? Because look, unless Chris Ilitch comes out of nowhere and says, hey, I'm ready to do $400 million for an extension. Like, I just don't see the Tigers extending Tarik Skubal. So what do? Do you trade him or do you let him walk?
Well, I mean, if you're able to add to your team the players that can help you win now and in the future, then you have to list, because I think out of the 30 clubs, 30 general managers, if you get an offer that, other than to say really young prospects that are years away, because the Tigers are ready to win now. So you don't want to trade a Tarik Skubal for guys that are, 5 years away, 4 years away, whatever. So, I think if you have an offer where you can get a package back where you can help win now and in the future, you have to listen. But those trades are very difficult to make in today's world. As you know, at the end of the day, if you don't get something that's going to help you win and win now, then your best bet is to keep Tarik and go for it while you have him. Because, then you got Casey Mize situation coming up and time moves. It's just like, hey, I'm getting older and your team is getting older and it's going to cost you more money. So you always have to have that revolving door and ready to bring in the next guy. So that's why it's a beautiful art. It's a science and an art,
To put a bow on everything here, and I really appreciate all your time. This has been so much fun hearing from you and catching up with you. What are you most proud of, and what is your biggest regret from your time with the Tigers?
Well, I really don't have any regrets, because to tell you the truth, if you put all the time and effort and you did the best job you can do, it was a passion for me, because I stay in touch with several guys all the time, and sometimes a guy will say, "Oh, you're living your best life right now." And I'm like, it's my second best life. My first best life was my passion, which was running a baseball team. Even when I started as a scouting director in Latin America, that was my passion. So you put everything and every effort, the relationships you built. If I felt like at any given time, I didn't give it my best effort, I did things not the right way, then I would have said, okay, I regret this. That's why I can't say I regret anything, because I put everything I had into it. At the same time, what I'm most proud of is, quite frankly, is the relationships over the years of the staff that I put together, past and present. One of the things I learned from Dave Dombrowski, who's going to be a Hall of Fame general manager, is those relationships count. And that camaraderie, which I miss a lot with the staff and working together, those are the things that I'm proud of. And when you see the team that is there today, that's not one person. That's an organization. That's a team. And that's what I'm most proud of, is putting that team together that brought this to the Detroit Tigers.
All right, Al Avila, that is all we have for you. And we covered a ton of topics. Thank you for joining the Days of Roar podcast. Hopefully we can get you on the show again at some point in the future, maybe during a postseason push with all your players leading the way.
Thank you.
Everyone, that was Al Avila, former general manager of the Detroit Tigers. It's time for all of us to get out of here. Thanks to Chris Brown from Tigers Minor League Report for co-hosting with me this week. And thanks to everyone for listening to the latest episode of Days of Roar. Please like, rate, share, and subscribe. Give us a rating and comment what you think about the show. Stick with free.com/sports for the latest Tigers coverage. I'd like to thank the editor of the Free Press, Nicole Avery Nichols, and our magical producer, Robin Chan. For the Detroit Free Press, I'm Evan Petzold. We'll catch you next week. Until then, go in peace.